For years, they thought she was gone, erased from the records, forgotten by history. But at Fort Clearwater, a single shot changed everything. This quiet woman, Helena Marlowe, once the deadliest sniper of Operation Iron Dagger, has returned. Not for glory, not for recognition, but to remind them that true legends never die. Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The sun burned over the Nevada desert when a small, quiet woman stepped through the gate at Fort Clearwater Training Range with an old M14 hugged close to her chest, gray windbreaker faded, shoulders a little hunched, eyes steady like she'd been here 1,000 times before. Recruits noticed, paused mid-banter, then laughed because that's what you do when something looks out of place on a strict military range at noon. "Ma'am, this area is restricted," a young range officer called out as dust curled around his boots. She nodded once, voice even, one round. "That's all I need." The line of privates traded jokes, a few louder than they needed to be. Someone offered her a bright AR with the safety still on, bolt locked as a prank, but she checked it without a word, handed it back, and set the M14 on the bench like it was the only tool that mattered. Captain Morgan Hale watched from the shade with arms folded, jaw tight, while Sergeant Evelyn Drake tracked everything with that instructor's stillness that misses nothing. Daniel Price, the bookish kid with glasses and a brain full of numbers, stayed quiet, studying her hands, the rhythm of her breathing, the way she sampled the wind with just a glance at the sand flicking across the berm. Targets sat at 300 meters, 3 steel plates offset at odd angles. The cadre had arranged to humble cocky shooters. No electronics on her rifle, just iron sights older than most of the faces staring at her. She aligned, exhale smooth, trigger press without drama, crack, one report slapping the dry air, the plate downrange sang out and then another, then the third chimed like a bell choir, 3 hits with 1 shot, the line going dead silent so fast it felt like the desert itself had stopped to listen. A range safety lifted his headset, frowning at the impossible angles. A private swallowed hard, Morgan's chin raised a millimeter, Evelyn's pencil froze on the clipboard. The woman eased the rifle open, checked the chamber, and started packing. No gloating, no look at me, just the ritual of a shooter who respects the tool more than the applause. Civilians must clear the line, Morgan said out of reflex, but even he sounded different now, like the ground had shifted under his boots. She nodded, shouldered the M14 with care, and turned toward the exit, wingcoat flapping once in the hot gust. Daniel couldn't help it. He stepped forward a half pace and caught a glimpse of the stock, cloth tape brown with age, not decoration, more like history held together by habit. He looked at the plates again, tracing imaginary lines in the air, seeing the geometry of a ricochet that would take a lifetime to master, maybe 2. The jokes were gone. The recruits stared at their boots or at the horizon where the heat shimmered like water that never arrives. Evelyn's voice came back first. "Reset the line," she said, steady as a metronome, but the cadence of the day had changed. Somewhere a flag snapped in the wind. Somewhere a story that didn't want a spotlight had just walked past them and left its imprint anyway. Morgan gave the order to log the string and file the anomaly, acting like paperwork could explain physics that refused to behave, yet his eyes stayed on the gate longer than necessary. Daniel's heartbeat slowed into a new kind of focus, not fear, not hero worship, just the feeling you get when the math lines up with something you don't have words for. He replayed the muzzle dip, the timing, the way her shoulders settled before the break, and he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she came, didn't know why one round felt like a conversation that wasn't finished. All he knew was the range had been one place when the morning started and a different place now, and if he didn't follow the thread, he'd regret it for a long time. As the woman disappeared into the glare, Daniel pushed his glasses up and fixed the picture in his memory: iron sights, brown tape, a breath like a clock, and he promised himself he'd find out who she was, because everything about that shot said legend, and legends don't happen by accident. Daniel told himself as the heat wavered over the berm and the range noise snapped back to normal like a rubber band that had been stretched too far, and by the time the brass details started sweeping the lanes he was already moving, not fast, not dramatic, just purposeful, cutting across the gravel to the control shack where the range cameras fed into a dusty monitor no one loved until it mattered. He asked the tech for the last string, voice steady enough to pass as routine, and when the clip rolled he leaned in, watching frame by frame as the muzzle settled, as the dust flick flared left to right, as the plate's first ring sent a sliver of light toward the second, the math lining up in a clean right-angle reflection that shouldn't be that clean at that distance with that rifle, and the hair on his arms lifted. Morgan stepped in behind him, the room suddenly smaller, arms crossed, the captain's tone cool: "Log it as an anomaly and move on." Evelyn hovered at the door, not interrupting, eyes narrowed like she could hear angles. Daniel nodded because that's what you do when rank speaks, but he copied the thermal overlay anyway: the bloom of heat around the barrel, the absence of any optic signature, the tiny shift in her shoulders that matched the gust flag 300 meters out. It wasn't luck, it was work, and the work had a fingerprint. He spent his dinner hour in the library cage, flipping through laminated field manuals that smelled like a decade of dust and coffee, finding a margin note in an old Ricochet annex nobody used except to quote urban legends: indirect trajectory engagement, 3-target sequence, feasibility, theoretical. Some unnamed instructor had underlined theoretical twice and scribbled prove it in a neat, stubborn hand. He thought of the cloth tape on the M14 and felt the same stubbornness rise in his chest. After lights out he stayed, the quiet of the admin building heavy like a closed book, sliding into the training network with his authorized login and then a little deeper with a script he shouldn't have written last semester, not to break anything, just to search harder. The word Clearwater turned up everything and nothing, the word Iron Dagger turned up almost nothing, and that was worse, because blank space is louder than redaction when you know the system. He backed out before he wrote himself into a corner, palms damp, pulse loud in his ears, then took the long walk past the empty bleachers to the line where the 3 plates still stood like question marks punched from steel. He pictured her again, the breath, the break, the way she didn't wait for applause, and he realized the conflict wasn't between her and the base, not yet. It was inside the room, between curiosity and caution, between protocol and the duty to learn from what you've seen. In the morning, Morgan ran the safety brief like nothing had happened, but his eyes flicked to the gate twice. Evelyn ran the qual like a metronome, but her corrections were tighter than usual, like she'd decided the margin of error had shrunk overnight. The recruits tried jokes and couldn't find the punchline. Daniel asked permission to review footage for instructional purposes, and the captain gave him that flat, unforgiving look that says, "I see the angle you're running, kid." He granted the request with conditions, and an hour later Daniel was annotating wind shear, spotting splash, and building a presentation that pretended to be about fundamentals but wrapped itself around one missing name. During the lull, he traced a path on the whiteboard, 3 lines, 3 bounces, and someone muttered, "No way," and someone else said, "Movies do that," and Evelyn cut the noise with a short, precise focus. But when everyone left she stood by the board, silent, then told him a story she wouldn't put in an email. Years ago, downrange gossip about a woman who could make bullets walk around corners. You don't believe gossip, but you notice when certain officers quit laughing first. The conflict sharpened when the training network threw him a permission error that shouldn't have triggered for the files he was opening. A minute later the Battalion S3 pinged Morgan about unusual queries, and Daniel realized his curiosity had just crossed into paperwork territory he didn't want. He closed everything, accepted the quiet dressing down in Morgan's office, the lecture about boundaries and clearances and how the mission is bigger than any one shooter's myth. But when the captain paused, Daniel said softly that the mission is also to learn from excellence wherever you see it, and for a heartbeat the room held two truths that didn't cancel each other out. Morgan finally told him to take a breath and keep it inside the wire. Evelyn told him to bring data, not stories. So he did. He built datasets of wind and impact and plate resonance, patterns that shouldn't exist without intentional angles, and that afternoon he submitted a dry, dull memo that hid its heartbeat in the footnotes. He knew it would land on a desk above his pay grade, maybe get ignored, maybe get him barred from the control shack for a month. But legends don't happen by accident, and neither do turning points, and as the desert cooled and the range emptied, he sat on the stone bench at the 300 line, eyes on the gate where she'd vanished, and understood the thing that would change everything had already started. The moment a shot none of them could explain refused to be filed as anomaly, and the moment a quiet woman made a whole base listen without saying a word. Was the same moment the inboxes started pinging up the chain, because silence has a way of echoing in places that matter, and by sunrise a terse message arrived on Morgan's screen ordering verification and a controlled demonstration. He read it twice, jaw tight, then called Evelyn and told her to prep a clean range, no tricks, no staged angles, every measurement logged. Daniel heard about it third hand and pretended he didn't, but he felt the charge in the air as the flag snapped and the bleachers filled with bodies that didn't usually watch quals, instructors from other companies, staff officers, a couple of civilians who wore their authority like quiet armor. The gate clicked and she came back, same gray windbreaker, same taped M14, same unhurried step like time belonged to her. Morgan met her at the 50, respectful but formal, laying out the parameters, 3 moving plates, randomized motion every 5 seconds, no optics, 1 round. She nodded once, no questions, eyes already downrange as if the range had been waiting for her. Evelyn ran through safety like scripture, voice steady, fingers ticking checkboxes. Daniel stood near the control shack with a tablet, catching wind data, trying not to feel like a kid at the edge of a legend. The plates jittered into their program, motors whining faintly, a pattern no one could memorize. The gust flag twitched, then held. The line went quiet in that specific way soldiers know, a collective breath before consequence. She mounted the rifle, iron sights aligned, shoulders settling into the worn stock like two old friends leaning in to hear each other. Her breathing found a cadence that matched the hum of the motors, then broke that cadence cleanly as the trigger moved. The shot cracked alive, a flat slap across the sand, and a heartbeat later 3 notes rang in a quick, impossible chord, 1, 2, 3, each plate chiming in turn like it had been asked the question and answered without stutter. For a second the wind had the floor, then sound returned like a wave rolling back. Someone swore softly. Someone laughed once and then shut it down like they'd stepped on their own foot. Morgan's lips thinned, not anger, something closer to respect he didn't hand out for free. Evelyn wrote faster than she ever had, then stopped writing altogether because there's a point where the pencil gets in the way of seeing. Daniel captured everything, barrel bloom, micro-movements, the tiny dust devils that announced crosswind shifts, and when he looked up he met her eyes for the first time. They were not looking for approval. They were confirming math. Morgan asked, formal again, if she'd consider training a select group. She didn't answer right away. The desert held space for a pause that felt like 20 years. "I teach what keeps people alive," she said finally, voice low, not dramatic, just true. "Not tricks." Not myths. Just choices. The word choices hit Daniel harder than he expected. The orders came through faster than the dust could settle: provisional contractor status, limited scope curriculum, observation by command. The afternoon turned into a clinic built on 3 simple corrections that cut deeper than they sounded. Breathe like you're not in a hurry. Press like you respect the consequence. Don't aim at a target you haven't defined in your head. She moved along the line, changing nothing and everything. She lowered a muzzle a fraction, adjusted a cheek weld with 2 fingers, told a kid who gripped too tight to unclench his jaw because hands follow teeth. Evelyn watched the recruits' groups tighten in real time and looked almost angry at how simple it seemed. Morgan hovered without hovering, letting the authority belong to the results. Daniel stood at her shoulder once, pointing at a tablet trace showing a flutter right before break. "That's not wind," she said, barely glancing. "That's you bracing for recoil you haven't earned yet." He swallowed a laugh at how cleanly she'd read him. He fixed it on the next shot and the steel answered with a solid, honest ring. During a short break she sat on the stone bench at the 300 like it was exactly where she'd planned to be, M14 across her knees, thumb smoothing the old tape as if it were a map. She didn't tell stories, but her silence drew one anyway, and by evening the range wore a different shape in everyone's head. The demo footage went upstairs and came back with fewer questions than anyone expected. The order for a week-long block of instruction landed on Morgan's desk with a paragraph about liabilities that read like it had been written by someone who'd just watched a myth refuse to be a myth. The first sunset class was the hardest. The desert cools fast and self-doubt cools faster. She made them shoot slow, then slower, then with eyes closed on empty chambers to teach the difference between flinch and break. She made them log every factor they could control and circle everything they couldn't, then told them the truth that lives between. You don't bend physics, you cooperate with it. Daniel took notes like his life depended on it, because maybe someone's would, someday. Evelyn drifted from skeptic to accomplice without announcing it, echoing corrections, shaving seconds off resets, barking less and saying more. Morgan stayed captain-shaped, but he didn't say anomaly again. On the 3rd evening, after a run of clean hits lit up the steel like a string of porch bells, the bass PA crackled with a last-minute notice: visiting brass in the morning, observation only. Daniel felt his stomach knot and understood why the wind felt colder than the temp. She didn't react at all. She stood, slung the M14 with the care of a medic setting down a stretcher, and gave one more correction that wasn't about shooting at all. If you don't know why you're pulling the trigger, that's the only miss that matters. It didn't sound like a motto. It sounded like a scar speaking. And just like that, the clinic ended for the day, the desert taking back its quiet, the range lights clicking off one row at a time as if dimming a stage that refused to admit it had a star, and Daniel walked out with the others knowing the conflict was no longer curiosity versus protocol but whether the base would let this kind of truth change the way it teaches people to survive. Was the question hanging in the air when the morning brought brass, wind, and trouble in the same breath, because the desert doesn't care about schedules and neither does fate. The visiting observers took their seats on the bleachers with that practiced stillness of people who sign orders instead of filling sandbags. Morgan ran the brief crisp as glass, Evelyn locked the line down, and Daniel felt the kind of nerves that make your mouth dry even when you're just holding a tablet. The flag on the berm jerked hard, then harder, a dust devil flicked across the 200 like a taunt, and Evelyn called a 5-minute weather hold that became 3 because the observers weren't here to watch clouds. She set up a complex drill anyway, 2 shooters per lane, staggered timing, moving steel at 250 and 300, strict arcs, ricochet cages in place, which would have been fine if the gusts hadn't hit sideways like a door slamming open. Helena stood at the 50 with her M14 slung, watching the wind the way a medic watches a pulse, and said in that even tone that wasn't a suggestion, slow it down. Morgan met her eyes and gave a small nod, but the first string had already started uprange where a motor stuttered, a plate shuddered, and a shot broke a hair late. The round rang steel and then skipped long at a weird angle, a freak bounce finding the lip of a rock cut behind the berm, suddenly headed toward the far side where a rear-rack crew, 2 kids, were kneeling behind the target shed. Evelyn's cease started and didn't finish because Helena was already moving, crossing to lane 3 with a speed that didn't look like speed until you realized how far she'd traveled, M14 coming off her shoulder and settling into the crook like gravity owed her a favor. She didn't line up on a target, she lined up on a problem, reading angles the way Daniel reads pages, taking a split-second slice of the world and deciding what it needed. The shot broke with a flat, unromantic crack, the bullet kissed a deflector plate, shaved right, took a controlled bounce off the damaged motor housing, and smacked the junk steel frame that had no business being miraculous, killing the bad ricochet's energy before it could ruin someone's life. The whole range went so quiet that the wind sounded like water. One of the rear-rack kids looked up, eyes wide, alive because someone else's math arrived first. Evelyn finished the ceasefire call with a voice that didn't shake, then turned on the loudspeaker and ordered a full cold range, everyone clear, belts cleared, chambers open, hands where she could see them. Morgan was already on the radio with range control logging the incident, voice low and strict, while the observers stood, suddenly more human than hierarchical. Daniel found himself breathing again only when he realized the back of his neck hurt from locking up. Helena safed the rifle, checked her bolt like a ritual, and only then let the adrenaline leave her shoulders. No theatrics, no victory grin, just a tiny exhale like a debt had been paid. The safety team moved, documented, photographed, measured, the malfunctioning motor was tagged out, the deflector geometry rechecked, the drill rewritten in pencil. On the bleachers a gray-haired man in a civilian blazer stepped down slow, the crowd parting the way crowds do for rank you can feel. Daniel didn't recognize him at first, but Morgan did, posture snapping straighter even before the handshake. General Richard Callahan, retired but clearly not retired inside his head. He took in the scene, then faced Helena with a salute that didn't belong to memos or history books, it belonged to a field somewhere far away. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "we were wrong to ask the wrong things of you and then ask you to disappear." She didn't blink, just accepted the weight of it. "We do what keeps people alive," she said. Today, that meant 1 round. He nodded once, eyes wet and unapologetic. The observers didn't clap, didn't dare, instead they sat back down like they'd been forced to learn something at an age when learning feels like surrender. Morgan cleared his throat and made the obvious choice. Training paused for a safety stand down, after action on the spot, then a revised progression built around control, not spectacle. Evelyn took the floor like a prosecutor and a teacher rolled together, walked the line through what went wrong and what went right, used Helena's intervention as an example of problem framing under pressure, not a party trick. Daniel built a fast model on his tablet, mapping wind vectors and rebound coefficients, showing how a bad bounce becomes a worse one when timing gets greedy. He didn't say hero, he said variables and consequences, and it landed better than any speech. The base shifted another inch that day. Not because a legend flexed, but because a system listened. After the observers left, Callahan stayed. He asked for a minute with Helena near the stone bench at the 300, the same bench where she watched sunsets like they were briefings. Daniel hung back at a respectful distance, close enough to hear pieces, far enough to let the past talk to itself. The general said he'd carried paperwork he regretted for 20 years. She said ghosts belong to the people who survived them, and that's enough. He saluted again, smaller this time, and that was the ceremony. In the afternoon, under a sky polished clean by wind, Helena restarted the clinic from zero. No movement drills, no crowd pleasers, just fundamentals until the range itself seemed to breathe easier. She taught them to name their trigger press the way medics name a pulse, to ride the brake like a wave that exists whether you ride it or not, to respect what steel can give and take. She also pulled the rear-act crew aside and thanked them for doing the unglamorous work that keeps everyone else's stories possible. The kid whose life she detoured tried to speak and couldn't. Evelyn's corrections grew almost gentle. Morgan's orders lost the grit of defensiveness and picked up the weight of responsibility. Daniel's notes expanded from angles to people, because the lesson had shifted from how to make a bullet dance to how to make a unit survive. At sunset, with the line cold and the motors quiet, Helena wrote 3 words on the whiteboard: purpose over pressure, and capped the marker like she was closing a case. Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. The range lights clicked off in sequence, and the desert took back its sound, and the question that had opened the day finally had an answer that felt earned. Yes, the base would change, because it had just watched the difference between a miracle and a method, and once you see it, you don't go back. And they didn't. The week that followed felt like someone had quietly swapped out the foundation under Fort Clearwater and poured a level surface where old habits used to wobble, because drills ran slower but hit harder, after-action notes got shorter but said more, and the recruits who used to crowd their sentences with excuses started cutting them down to data points and fixes. Morgan trimmed the daily schedule to make room for Helena's fundamentals block, a decision that would have looked like softness any other month but now read like discipline. Evelyn rewrote the qual prep checklist so that purpose sat above part-time, then enforced it with the same blunt fairness that makes people trust rules again. Daniel slid from the edge of the line into the flow of it, not as the kid who chases rumors but as the guy who can translate the wind into adjustments and turn the whiteboard into a scoreboard that tells the truth. The numbers answered first: tighter groups across lanes, fewer malfunctions from rushed cycles, a clean drop in stress flinch because she made them respect the empty chamber drill until their bodies stopped lying to their heads. But the bigger change sat in the way people listened. Helena could stand behind a shooter, say 3 words: breathe, decide, press, and you could watch arrogance soften into attention without anyone losing face. She was there most mornings before first formation, sitting on the stone bench at the 300 with that old M14 across her lap, thumb passing once across the frayed tape as if checking a memory for cracks, and Daniel learned to leave her that quiet until she stood on her own and nodded at the line like class was open. She never told war stories. When asked, she moved the conversation back to choices, to how a bad angle and a good excuse still equals a bad outcome, to how recoil lives in the future tense and you don't get to be there early. Callahan came back once, not with a crowd, just long enough to watch a lane fix itself under her coaching. He spoke with Morgan by the bleachers, words low and plain, then left the way he arrived, carrying less weight on his shoulders than the first time. Evelyn stopped calling the myth a myth. She started catching herself before sarcasm, swapping it for a correction that landed twice as hard because it aimed at what could be fixed. The base made room for new habits, a laminated wind log at every lane, a rule that you don't touch the trigger until you can explain the shot to someone who wasn't watching, a quiet practice of tapping the bench on your way out like a promise you intend to keep. Daniel and Helena found a rhythm that wasn't chatter. He'd hold the tablet, she'd glance once, and he'd already know what she was about to say. Then she'd say it anyway because clarity matters under stress. The first time a Recon class beat last quarter's average by a mile, Morgan didn't smile, not exactly, but he exhaled like a man who'd finally swapped way down for buy-in. On a blue sky Wednesday, Helena ended the session early, not because the hits were bad but because they were good for the wrong reasons. She made them clear rifles, step back, and articulate why they chose each shot. And when a private said because it was there, she said that's not a reason, that's a habit, and it landed with the kind of embarrassment that grows into pride later. That night, Daniel drafted a training note titled Purpose Over Pressure, bullet points neat, examples tight, nothing about legends, everything about repeatable work. He left it on Morgan's desk and found it pinned to the ready board the next day without edits. The shift showed up in places that don't get counted, fewer eye rolls at safety briefs, more help at the brass buckets, a quiet thank you for the rear-rack crew that used to be invisible. The clinic kept going, not as an event now but as a spine. Helena never raised her voice, never wasted a word, never let the M14 become a relic or a relic become an excuse. Then one morning she didn't come. No text, no heads up, just an empty bench at the 300 and a line of shooters who'd learned not to fill silence with noise. Evelyn ran the warm-up anyway, voice steady, and Morgan called range control to double-check nothing was wrong off-post, nothing flagged. Daniel walked the line like he was checking targets but really he was checking absence, and when he reached the bench he saw it, a single sheet of paper tucked under the smooth stone, handwriting clean but a little uneven like the pen had felt heavier than usual. He read the note once, then twice, then folded it careful and brought it to Morgan and Evelyn, who read it the way people read instructions for a job that matters. It didn't announce a farewell. It didn't explain where she'd gone. It said what she'd said since the first day, stripped down to the core: don't aim to hit the target if you don't know why you're pulling the trigger, and then a scrawl of a signature that wasn't a name so much as a call sign you only earn by paying an invoice nobody sees. The range stood still for a breath, then Morgan put the note in a clear sleeve and fixed it to the whiteboard where the whole company could see, and nobody made a speech because the point had already been made. Training resumed, but it felt different in the best way. Recruits coached each other in the language she taught them, Evelyn sharpened the drills without hardening the people, Daniel turned the memo into a checklist that traveled across units like a rumor that stuck because it worked. A week later, after one more set of scores landed heavy on the right side of the curve, base leadership made a quiet decision and a louder sign. The plaque went up near the bench, brushed steel with modest letters: Clearwater 017 Shooting Complex, and if you knew, you knew. No parade, no anthem, just the desert wind moving across the berm and the kind of respect that is earned without ceremony. Daniel sat on the bench at the end of that day, the M14 absent but not gone, and he realized the resolution wasn't about closure, it was about continuity, about a method built to outlast the hands that taught it. The base had changed, the method had roots, the story kept moving even when its quiet center had stepped out of the frame, and no one went back. Because once a range learns to breathe differently, the air itself won't tolerate the old rhythm, and weeks turned into months with the plaque at the 300 line shining dull under desert sun, a reminder carved in steel that stories don't have to be told to be remembered. Recruits rotated through Fort Clearwater like they always had, but the tone shifted, jokes at the expense of strangers dried up, eyes sharpened on the fundamentals, and somewhere in the middle of every class someone inevitably asked about the taped stock rifle and the faded windbreaker, not because they'd seen her but because they'd felt the wake she left behind. Evelyn made the story short: respect what you don't understand until you do, and then put them back on the line, because myth doesn't excuse bad groups. Morgan enforced the new standard without speeches, letting numbers talk, and the numbers kept climbing until other bases started to notice. Requests for exchange instructors came encoded as best practice sharing, but everyone knew they were chasing whatever Clearwater had found in the desert. Daniel became the accidental bridge, the one who could package a legend into data sets and lesson plans without betraying the silence that gave it weight. He stripped out names, scrubbed call signs, left only the angles, the corrections, the choice-driven logic, and sent it up the chain until it wore an official header. When battalions across the country ran drills on indirect trajectories, when ricochet math showed up in PowerPoints that bored everyone until the first impossible hit landed, no one mentioned Helena, but her fingerprints pressed through every page. The culture shifted too. young soldiers stopped equating quiet with weak, started asking before assuming, started seeing experience in wrinkles instead of dismissing it. Evelyn noticed first when a private who used to mouth off started holding back to listen, not out of fear but out of earned respect. Morgan noticed when safety reports came back cleaner, fewer negligent discharges, fewer corners cut. Daniel noticed in himself the way he no longer needed to chase myths because he'd seen how one act can reset an entire system. And still, sometimes, he walked to the bench at dusk with his tablet off and his hands empty, sat where the plaque caught the fading light, and tried to hear what she might have said if she'd stayed. He never heard words, but he always left with steadier breathing. Callahan visited one last time, older than the first visit, slower, but lighter. He stood by the plaque, saluted it as if saluting her, then told Daniel quietly that some debts can't be repaid except by carrying them well. Daniel nodded, understanding more than he could articulate, and promised he would. The base built around that promise. The recruits graduated into units that carried pieces of the method with them, and reports filtered back of firefights where someone remembered to pause, to breathe, to decide, and lives were saved because a shot wasn't wasted. The legacy multiplied, invisible and undeniable. It wasn't a parade, it wasn't headlines, it was survival measured in people who got to come home. On the anniversary of the plaque, the company held a small formation at sunset, not mandatory but full anyway, no speeches, just a moment of silence, then rifles cleared and tapped against the bench in a ritual nobody wrote down but everybody kept. Daniel led it, Evelyn closed it, Morgan signed the logbook with a steady hand. When the sun dropped behind the ridge, they dismissed themselves, but the lesson stayed. The conclusion wasn't closure, because closure belongs to endings and this was built for continuance. The conclusion was recognition that mastery doesn't live in noise, it lives in quiet competence passed from hand to hand, and that the best shots are the ones you never have to take, but if you do, they must count. Helena Marlowe had stepped off the stage long ago, yet her presence shaped every line of fire that followed. The base carried her forward not in name, not in ceremony, but in every breath a soldier took before a trigger press, in every decision made with purpose over pressure. And when the wind moved across Clearwater's 017 shooting complex, brushing the plaque and the bench with the same dry patience it had always had, it carried her story with it, silent, steady, unbroken, a legend that proved you don't need recognition to change the way the next generation survives.